Okay, hopefully after you went through the photosynthesis flowchart and then you watched the lecture, it made way more sense than if you just did it by itself. You can do it either way. Some people do watch the lecture and then do the flowchart. I just suggest trying to puzzle it out. Same thing for cellular respiration. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to open the flowchart guide and we're going to write in the equation. We know that cellular respiration is the opposite of photosynthesis. So it's C6H12O6 plus 6O2, right? 6 oxygen is going to give us 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus ATP or energy. Okay? So now that I have the equation, I can start looking at my word bank and try to determine where things might belong. Well, I see that I'm going to have a lot more ATP here. Okay, so I've got 2 ATP, 2 ATP, 2 ATP, and then 36 ATP. I'm making a lot of ATP in this whole process, okay? I also see some things that look similar to the coenzyme NADPH that we had seen in photosynthesis. So we have FADH2 and NADH, and so there's a good chance that these NADHs and FADHs are going to play a role in a coenzyme sort of way. So starting with that, let's look at the flowchart and see if we can't figure out where some of these ATPs and NADHs and FADHs belong. So if this is my flowchart, it's a little bit bigger than what we saw in photosynthesis, and that's because cellular respiration has 2 different processes that can occur. We can either have aerobic or anaerobic respiration, but let's look at it and see if we can figure out where ATP belongs. Now, I know that any of these diamond shapes are going to be ATP. So I can put in, if I wanted to, as placeholders, ATP, right? I don't necessarily even need to put in how many ATP. I just need to put in ATP. And that can be enough for now. I also know that I'm going to have some places where my NADH and FADH2s come out. And looking, I have 3 spots where I'm going to see coenzymes, and I have 1 FADH2, 1 NADH, and 1 NADH. The first one has 2, and the second one has 6. So those numbers might matter, or they might not, but let's look and think about it for a second. Okay, I have 3 spots, and I have NADH twice and FADH2 once. There's a really good chance that I'm not going to see NADH and NADH coming out of the same process. Then I would just say 8 NADH rather than 6. So we could say with relative certainty that it's 2 FADH2 and a NADH. Maybe I don't know the number, but that's okay, right? And I could put an NADH here. What I'm doing is I am going through my process of elimination, my critical thinking, and I'm seeing if I can't figure out where things go to minimize what I have to look at on my word bank. So I have kind of already figured out roughly where my ATPs and NADHs go, and maybe I have to find the numbers, but that's fine. We can just ignore them for a little bit, okay? Now I'm going to look at the rest of my words in my word bank, and I'm going to do the same thing like I did with photosynthesis, where I try to determine if something is a process step, a location, a reactant or product, or a byproduct. And so I'm going to look again at my equation, and I know that glucose is going to be a reactant. So I look for glucose, and I put reactant, right? I am going to look too, and I'm going to say, oh, well, oxygen is also going to be a reactant. So I should see oxygen on here somewhere. Or maybe I forgot to include oxygen on here. We'll just put it on there right now. Okay. That's good. That tells me that I have to fix this. It should be after mitochondria, because it should be alphabetical. All right, so I've got oxygen now, okay? So oxygen is going to be on here, and I know that that is a reactant as well. I know that when I look at my equation, things that are on the product side are either energy or what we would consider waste or byproduct. So carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct then, and water is a byproduct. Okay, good. I know right off the bat, cytoplasm is always a location because that's one of the organelles in the cells. And then I look at the rest and I go, okay, cool. I don't know what pyruvate is. That's fine. Aerobic and anaerobic. Well, I know that aerobic, like you're doing aerobics, right? It's a workout. So that probably means something. Anaerobic, if you see the word an, the an or a in front of something, that means without. So one of these means with something, and one of this means without something, okay? Even without knowing what aerobic means, you know already that aerobic means with and anaerobic means without. The citric acid cycle. That sounds like a step, right? The electron transport chain. That also sounds like a step. Ethanol. Not really sure what that is. I know that ethanol, maybe I know that it's an alcohol, but I'm not really sure where that belongs. Fermentation. That sounds like a step. Maybe I put step there as my placeholder, right? Glycolysis. Well, again, we know that lysis means to break or burst. So glycolysis probably means to break something with a sugar because glyco generally means sugar. So I know that this is probably a step, okay? Lactic acid, you might know what lactic acid is, and you then know that it is going to be a byproduct or a product. We don't know yet which one it is. Mitochondrial cristae and mitochondrial matrix. Well, I might not know which one means which. I know that these are both locations because the mitochondria is one of those organelles, and so that tells us that it is a location. Once we've done some of this, and maybe again, I don't have a tag on everything, I can go back to my flowchart and see if I can't start looking at my clues and filling it in. Well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look to see if there's anything that says with or without, okay? So on here, we see without O2 and with O2. Well, when I was looking at my word bank, I knew that aerobic meant with something, in this case with oxygen, and anaerobic meant without oxygen. So I can fill those in. So I have two kinds of respiration that can occur. I can have aerobic respiration when I have oxygen present, or anaerobic respiration when there isn't oxygen present, which also means though that there is some sort of step that occurs before either process can continue. Okay, so I filled in a little bit here. That's great. Let's go back to the beginning. Cellular respiration begins somewhere with something which breaks something. Okay, I know. You look at it and go, I don't know, this looks like a lot. It's not. Let's break it down by pieces. Well, I know that only one thing seems to get broken in this process. If I go back to my word bank here, I know that there's a word that means to break. Lysis means to break, and glyco means sugar. So if this flow chart is that something is getting broken, there's a really good chance that that process is going to be glycolysis. Glycolysis is going to break glucose. And that makes sense, right? We know that glyco means sugar, glycolysis means to break sugar, and we know that glucose is a big molecule. We talked about how at the end of photosynthesis, glucose is a big molecule. It's too big to move through the membranes of the mitochondria and the chloroplast. And so we're not going to see glucose just immediately moving into the mitochondria. Instead, it needs to be processed first. But in order to break anything, I do require some energy. Now, do you think I'm going to require 36 energy or maybe just 2 energy? Well, if this process is meant to make ATP or make energy, then there is no way that I'm going to start by requiring 36 ATP. That would be so inefficient, and we would not have seen the end of symbiotic theory, and mitochondria would have just gotten consumed and it wouldn't exist. So we can say with relative certainty that 2 ATP are required in glycolysis to break glucose into 3 carbon sugars. Great. If this is happening before the mitochondria, because glucose is too big to fit in the mitochondria, the only location I have left as a place that is outside of the mitochondria is the cytoplasm. And so I can put that cellular respiration begins in the cytoplasm with glycolysis, which breaks glucose by using 2 ATP. Now, let's go back to this ATP and NADH here, okay? If we know that 36 ATP coming out here would mean we would not have to continue with any of the other steps, because why would I do the rest if I got all of my ATP from doing glycolysis? Okay, again, the mitochondria would be pointless. I can make the safe assumption that this has to be 2 ATP coming out, and it is. Glycolysis produces a net gain of 2 ATP. It also produces a little bit of NADH. Okay, it's not going to produce the most because we're starting this process. We're getting just a little bit out at a time. We're not at the end where we're generating a huge amount of anything. We are starting the process. And so this NADH is not going to be my 6 NADH. I'm not there yet. Remember, I'm still having a sugar here, which means that it has to have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. I can't take all of the hydrogens off if I am still going to have a sugar molecule here. I am going to tell you that if you go through this whole thing, by process of elimination, you will end up with 2-pyruvate here. Okay? Pyruvate is a 3-carbon sugar. So if I say that I have 2-pyruvate at the end of glycolysis, it makes sense because a 6-carbon sugar is getting broken in half to 2 3-carbon sugars. We're still maintaining the number of carbons that we have, but now is when we're going to see a differentiation of whether that pyruvate is used without oxygen or used with oxygen. Let's do anaerobic respiration first. There are times when cells will not have enough oxygen, and there are some organisms that don't rely on oxygen at all. There are some organisms that are completely anaerobic and will go through some sort of process called fermentation. Fermentation is the process of completing energy processing without oxygen. No oxygen is going to be something that you come into when you're actively exercising and you exceed your aerobic capacity. You're panting, your cells are starved for oxygen. It's okay, that's normal, that's part of working out. And your cells still need energy. They're going to switch to survival mode, which means that while they're not getting enough oxygen, they're still going to go through the process of glycolysis and retrieving a little bit of ATP. But then those processes have to be reversed, which happens over a period of time. Fermentation. Once you start thinking about fermentation, you might start thinking about fermented foods. Things like yogurt, soy sauce, kimchi. You might also start thinking about when you do exceed your aerobic capacity and you start exercising and then your muscles get sore. You're going to have micro tears, which make your muscles sore, but you also end up with a lactic acid buildup. So if we go back to our word bank here, we do see that lactic acid is something that is formed, and that makes sense when we don't have enough oxygen present. We are going to make a lactic acid. And if I want a fermented drink like beer or wine, there's going to be alcohol in it. Alcohol can be produced in various ways. We have ethanol here as an example, but you could just put alcohol in general. Your cells will produce ethanol and lactic acid as a response of not having enough oxygen. And then over a period of time, your liver will reverse this process and actually convert this lactic acid back into pyruvate. And then ethanol is released through your urinary system by removing it from your blood. Isn't that cool? Cool. That knocks out a good chunk of our word bank, right? We did aerobic and anaerobic. We did the cytoplasm, right? We figured out where pyruvate goes. We figured out glycolysis and glucose. We figured out fermentation and ethanol as well as lactic acid. Oxygen wasn't on here because I had it with and without oxygen with aerobic. So oxygen is already filled in on the chart for us. So what does that mean? Well, now is when we get to start going, okay, we now have oxygen. Oxygen is required for cellular respiration in the mitochondria. Okay, no oxygen, the mitochondria doesn't work. You need oxygen for your mitochondria. You only breathe oxygen for your mitochondria. So when I have aerobic respiration, I'm going to move into the mitochondria. Now, here's where I might not know if I'm talking about the mitochondrial cristae or the mitochondrial matrix, but in any case, I am moving into the mitochondria. And my next step is also going to be in the mitochondria. That's the only place that they can be because those are the only locations we have left. So we'll put placeholders of mitochondria in there, and we'll see if we can puzzle it out at the end, okay? The mitochondria starts with a process that is going to break that 3-carbon sugar down into its component parts, which means that I'm removing a bunch of hydrogens, okay, and I'm using oxygen and breaking oxygen down, so oxygen is going different places. But I am going to go through something here. Now, if you remember in photosynthesis, our first step was the light-dependent reactions. And the light-dependent reactions generate the most ATP because there's a membrane involved. Now, if I were generating 36 ATP in this second step, I probably wouldn't go on to the third step. And so I can assume, once again, that I am only making 2 ATP from this process. As such, that narrows it down and says that I am making 36 ATP from this final process. This is where I'm going to see the most ATP come out, and that makes sense, because why, again, would I go to the last steps if I did not have if I made all my ATP in the early steps, okay? I also know that I am taking a 3-carbon sugar here, but there are no more sugars moving through this last and final step. And so I have to see that carbon going somewhere. And we know that carbon is a byproduct. So we see carbon dioxide here. Carbon dioxide is released by the step called the citric acid cycle. Okay? The citric acid cycle releases carbon dioxide and it generates 6 NADH, 2 FADH2, which again is the only time we see the FADH2, and 2 ATP, and that is a cycle. Cycles need space, okay? I'm going to tell you that the mitochondrial matrix is going to be where we see the citric acid cycle occur. The matrix is the middle of the mitochondria, and therefore is going to be where a cycle can occur with the space it needs. The mitochondrial cristae is a membrane, okay? I like to think of it as the crease, a crease in your clothing. A crease in your clothing is like a membrane. So the mitochondrial cristae is going to be the last step is the location of the last step of cellular respiration. And if we come back here, we can do our steps, and we can do the citric acid cycle. We can clear out carbon dioxide, and that leaves us with the electron transport chain, which I identified as a step, and water. So again, here we have our last step of the ETC, the electron transport chain, which is producing ATP and water as a byproduct, which is why it requires oxygen. And that's it. So when we go through cellular respiration and photosynthesis, the thing to remember is that we are maintaining a balance of those nutrients, that carbon, that hydrogen, that oxygen. They are being recycled, they are being moved from their bonds into new bonds, but they're not being destroyed. And in doing so, we are trapping energy because breaking chemical bonds can release energy, which our cells are very functionally capable of trapping and using as ATP. And some of that energy is then lost as heat. I hope you had fun filling this out. I know it can be a little frustrating, but part of it is puzzling it through and seeing if you can't figure it out using your context clues. Let me know if you have any questions.